My name is Andrew Blakers and I'm from the Australian National University, but I spent 10 years at the University of New South Wales doing a PhD and a few postdocs in the period 79 to 89, and then a couple more years, 1991. So I used to know UNSW quite well, but if you drop me on campus anywhere now, I think I'd be lost. It's all changed. So I'm going to talk about 100% renewable electricity, and I'll aim to do it all in about 40 minutes or less, leaving plenty of time for questions if there are any. And I'll start off with the most important slide, which basically is the message that PV has won the race, hands down, left to right, back, front, up, down, lay down misère, PV has won. To be more precise, silicon PV has won. And it's really, really hard to think of any possible way that silicon PV can get dislodged in the next few decades from the absolute runaway winner of the energy race, not the electricity race, the energy race. And the closely related message is the only way we're going to address climate change is silicon PV. There is no other prospective possibility. So this is simply a graph of the new installed capacity, net new global installed capacity, between changes between 2015 in green and 2017 in red. Every single generation technology is either static or minuscule or going backwards, like coal. PV doubled, and PV is completely unconstrained by any practical mechanism, whereas all of the other technologies are heavily constrained by this or that different mechanism. And PV is going to just go to completion, I would suggest, over the next 5 years. Silicon PV, to be precise. So this is a map of Australia where the noon equivalent sunshine hours are shown. Those are the numbers. And up in the northwest, there's plenty of sunshine. And the green circle is the area of Australia that we required with current PV technology to provide the entire world's electricity. And the red dot is Australia's electricity, assuming none of it is on rooftops. And another interesting feature of this map is that southwest Tasmania, where it rains a lot, has 3.5 noon equivalent sunshine hours per day on average. And that's better than all of Northern Europe and much of Northern Asia and not much of Northern America. So Australia really has a lot of sunshine, and it's also got a lot of wind. Most people live in the sun belt. That's plus or minus 30 degrees of latitude. Something like 2/3 of the world's population lives there. Their voices are barely heard in the discussion about climate change and what to do about it. Very loud voices in the northern hemisphere tend to drown out the large majority of the world's population who don't have cold winters, who don't have a nearly zero solar resource in winter, who do have large heating loads. Most of the world does not have to worry about heating. It doesn't have to worry much about water heating, and it doesn't have to worry about storage from season to season. So PV, silicon PV, has enjoyed rapid exponential growth. And this growth is set to continue. It might go up and down a little bit by little bit, but I can't see any constraint on PV growing and growing essentially until it completely dominates. And one of the reasons for the rapid growth is the ever-falling price. So this is a graph of the price of PV along the vertical axis versus the cumulative module shipments. And it's been following a learning curve of about 20% or so for many decades, which means that every time you double the cumulative sales or production, then you reduce the price by about 20%. And silicon PV has a long way to go before it runs out of this price learning curve. This is very typical of many industries. As volume of production goes up and up, the price goes down and down as manufacturers learn how to make it better and as continual research learns how to take shortcuts. So silicon is the backbone of the solar industry. The solar thermal industry is minuscule. The solar PV industry is very large, with sales of hundreds of billions per year, and silicon is about 94-95%. That's the dark and light blue, and everything else in the PV industry that's primarily cad telluride from one company for solar occupies the remainder. And it's difficult to see this changing because silicon is such a wonderful material. It's the number 2 element in the Earth's crust. We couldn't possibly run out of it. It's not toxic. It's also the basis of the integrated circuit industry. So there's a huge amount of technology transfer between the industries. People know and trust crystal silicon. It's bankable. There's a whole raft of reasons why crystal silicon is really a very, very good PV material. So the silicon solar cell is now doing to energy what the silicon chip did to electronics about 2 or 3 decades ago. In other words, killing off all the competitors at a huge rate of knots. So I'll just talk a little bit about the importance of silicon and why I don't think it's going to get displaced any time in the next decade or 3. And that is because it's got high and stable efficiencies. And there's an ever decreasing cost of PV systems. What this graph shows is the dark blue is the module cost, and all of the rest are the other costs. And typically the module cost has been half or more of the total cost of a completed turnkey system mounted in some field somewhere. But the silicon solar module cost is falling faster because it's got a learning curve still, whereas glass, for example, we've pretty much wrung all of the cost reductions possible out of glass. And so the cost of the module is falling quite fast towards 1/3 of the total system cost. And if you decrease the cost of the module even more, you only make a small change in the overall system cost, whereas if you increase the efficiency a little bit, you leverage across almost the entire value chain. So that means there's a premium on efficiency, and it's fairly clear that the efficiency of commercial modules, standard off-the-shelf commercial modules, will continue to increase. And in fact, there's pretty much certain that there's a 20% increase in efficiency locked in already, and that alone is enough to reduce the current price for silicon PV systems from about $50 a megawatt hour for a 0.5 gigawatt or above rated system to around about $40 a gigawatt hour, even if there were no other changes. Simply the move of the efficiency trend through the module alone is going to produce a dramatic figure, which is $40 a megawatt hour Australian, which is below the marginal cost of running a black coal power station. So in other words, silicon PV in the next few years is going to directly challenge existing black coal power stations for electricity prices. Not new build, but existing. Another consequence of the high and stable efficiencies for silicon is that any non-silicon materials have to match that. Because the silicon module price is down around 1/3 of the total system cost, even if the solar cells in those modules is free, literally, which of course is never going to happen, you still have to have a high stable efficiency over 30 years in order to match it with the silicon. And there's added enormous obstacles for any pretender new material in that it'll take many, many years for banks to trust it and offer the billion-dollar loans required to build gigawatt-rated systems, which is what you need to be competitive. So my conclusion is that silicon was, is, and will continue to be 90% plus of the world solar market. There's a big change happening in the design of solar cells. So the orangey bit there is the Perk solar cell, which is rapidly taking over the worldwide industry, and that's likely to go to completion over the next few years as the aluminium back surface field solar cell, which has inherently lower efficiency, is phased out. And the Perk solar cell was actually developed right here at Uni of New South Wales in 1988. And it was part of a group of innovations that flowed out of the University of New South Wales, starting with the first 18% efficient solar cell in 1984, then the first 19% also in 1984, then the first 20% efficient silicon cell in 1986, then the 22 to 23% Perk cell in 1988 to 1990, and then further work on Perk cells in the period in the late 90s, pushing it up into the up to 25%. So it took a couple of decades for this to flow through to industry, but it is now flowing through to industry with a vengeance. And in fact, it's interesting to look at the Perk solar cell as a fraction of global net new generation capacity additions per year. And in 2018, the Perk silicon solar cell will be something like 12 to 15% of all new generation capacity of any description, fossil, nuclear, renewables. 15%. And that is likely to head up into conceivably the 50% range over the next decade. But it's very hard to extrapolate so far in advance with any predictability. But what can be fairly sure is that it'll hit 20% of global net new capacity additions in 2020. This is serious money, something like $30 billion in sales so far for the Perk solar cell. So as PV, with support from wind in those countries that have wind, such as Australia, rises up towards 50, then 100% renewable electricity, you have to worry about how you're going to stabilise the electricity system. And the first point to make is that if you have wind and PV, then you really do have a big advantage, because often the wind and the sun are counter-correlated, and that hugely reduces the amount of storage that you need. You need to disperse the wind and the PV over very large areas so that local wind lulls or local cloud does not affect your overall electricity system. So the national electricity market covers an area of roughly 1 million square kilometres up the eastern seaboard of Australia, and that allows you to have a very wide range of local weather and climate, and variable demand, and a wide range of demands as well, from cold winter in the south to warm summer in the north. And there's been enormous improvements in high voltage interconnectors, as I'll describe in a moment. So it really is not very difficult to take solar and wind electricity from Townsville and put it in Hobart, or take renewables from Perth and put it in Sydney. Demand management's obviously important. We need to be quite assiduous in shifting loads from the night to the day to match the ever-increasing amount of solar. And we also need to have much larger bundling of interruptible loads, so that when we do have a short-term supply shortfall, like a hot summer afternoon, then we can interrupt loads that are not very important. And this is very straightforward technology. But in the end, we do need some storage, and pumped hydro is 97% of all storage around the world, and batteries are also going to be quite important. So high voltage DC, I wonder how many people are aware of the astonishing changes that are happening in intra and intercontinental transmission of electricity. So state of the art now would be a 1.1 million volt cable made of aluminium, about that diameter, strung on a tall pole that doesn't look a lot different from the existing high voltage power lines, that's transmitting 12 gigawatts, which is a third of Australia's peak demand, over 3,000 kilometres, which is the distance, more than the distance from Townsville to Hobart, and is about the distance from Perth to Adelaide. It is now highly feasible to transmit really serious amounts of power from one side of a continent to the other, and even between continents under the sea is going to be feasible over the next decade. And of course, the huge advantage of being able to transmit from north to south is that you can compensate for summer, winter, and east to west, you can compensate as the sun moves across the sky. So I think the future of energy supply in Asia is not going to be gas from Russia, it's going to be high voltage DC from Vladivostok to London, so that the power goes one direction during one part of the day and the other direction in the other part of the day. And a very large advantage of interconnecting countries like that is that they then can't afford to go to war with each other. And this is really important, I think, in a fraught world, and this is one of the reasons why Germany and France couldn't go to war again after the Second World War. They deliberately split their coal and steel making up so that France had one and Germany had the other, and neither had both. So the red lines there essentially show where Australia's current high voltage AC backbone is. There's a couple of DC connectors in there, but they're pretty small beer by international standards. However, with high voltage DC, it's quite feasible to connect the northwest to the southwest system in Western Australia, connect West Australia to the main part of Australia, and connect Townsville to the big cities in the south. And Townsville just happens to have fabulous wind and sun that is highly anti-correlated with the wind and the sun in the south. In terms of storage, pumped hydro is where it's all at. There's a couple of 100 gigawatts of pumped hydro storage now around the world. And there's also a couple of 100 gigawatts of high voltage DC capacity, I might add. And virtually all of it is pumped hydro because it's so much cheaper compared with batteries. It's even cheaper than battery hype, and that's really saying something. So this is Australia's largest pumped hydro system. It's the Tumut 3 power station, which is in the Snow Mountains. And you can see there 6 pipes coming down the hill with a height difference of 150 metres, and the water can come down, and the water can also be pumped up simply by reversing the turbines, putting electricity into the turbines to make the water go up the hill. And when you need that energy back again, you simply let the water come back down through the turbines. Round trip efficiency 75 to 85%, just a little bit below a battery, and 1.5 gigawatts of power available on demand. And the upper reservoir is actually the lower reservoir of the proposed Snowy 2.0 system, which connects that reservoir with Tantangara, and it would have a head not of 150 metres but 650 metres. And head is very important, the height difference, because if you double the head, then you double the power, you double the energy, but you don't double the cost. So that's why big heads are valuable. And you can do it off-river. This is an example in China. The creek down the bottom is just a creek, it's not a big river. And they put a little dam across it and then built an artificial reservoir up the top. There's a 900 metre head, which is nearly as good as the best sites in Australia, in fact. And that's 1.8 gigawatts with 7 hours of storage. So that would take care of most of the day-night issue if you had a solar-dominated grid. An important point about off-river as opposed to on-river pumped hydro is that flood control costs are very small. If you go to a river-based hydro system, half the cost seems to be dealing with the 1 in 100 or 1 in 1,000 year flood. If you don't have a river, because both the upper and lower reservoirs are not on a river, then you eliminate that cost entirely. So we did a GIS site search for the whole of Australia, looking for all of the pumped hydro sites that have better than 300 metre head, which is double the Tumut 3 power station head, and have more than about a gigawatt hour of storage. And we found 22,000 of them in flat and arid Australia. And the number of sites is about 1,000 times more than we'd need to support a 100% renewable electricity system. So we can afford to be extremely choosy and just pick the very best sites. We'd only need about 20 or 40 of them, depending on how big each one of them was, to support 100% renewables. And you can go to our website and download the coordinates and details of each and every one of those 22,000 sites. And you can download a KMZ file, which would allow you to fly around like you're on a drone using Google Earth. And you would see something like this, where the upper reservoirs are mapped. You can see the wall, which is the sort of white line at the base of each of the reservoirs, and we have the spreadsheet gives you information about how much rock's in that wall, how much water is in the reservoir, what's the area, the altitude and all the rest. And this happens to be Araluen, and any one of the bigger reservoirs there has enough water to provide all the storage required for New South Wales to get to 100% renewable electricity. So we're talking about very small areas of reservoir to support the entire 100% Australian electricity system. We're now looking worldwide, and we hope to knock this off over the next few months. We'll find every reservoir site worldwide with a relaxed constraint of 200 metres head, and this will also pick up a lot of the brownfield sites such as old mining sites. So what you see there is red areas are highly prospective for off-river pumped hydro, and the other colours are slightly less prospective, blue being the least prospective in that the potential head is only 200 metres, red the potential head is 800 metres. So when we've finished, we'll have found all of the 10 to 100 million pumped hydro sites around the world, and you'll be able to zoom down on a map like that and visualise each and every single one of them in your backyard or in your area of interest or near your wind farm or near your solar farm. So that's Africa, which is one of the less blessed continents for pumped hydro. North America has, of course, the Rockies and to a lesser extent the Appalachians. Mexico and Central America are blessed with very large numbers of excellent sites. The Andes, of course, have unlimited sites. Of course, most of the people live in the east. There are some sites there, not as good as the Andes, but there are sites in Brazil. The Alps in Europe are highly prospective, of course. By the way, all of this data excludes national parks and World Heritage Areas, so we don't even look inside those. West Asia has got the Himalayas and the western extension of the Himalayas. So there's unlimited sites in India, both in the north and the south. China is blessed with fabulous pumped hydro opportunities and wind and solar, and a central location in Asia. So China is really going to be the key for electrifying the world of half the world's population. But Korea, Taiwan, Japan, they've all got great numbers of sites, vastly more than they need, probably 100 times. Southeast Asia is looking pretty good. Just need to find a mountain that is not an active volcano. And on the same scale, Australia, with its 22,000 sites, doesn't look very good, but it's also still got 1,000 times more sites than it needs. So we've just started on the rest of the world, and we've done a few test runs on a few states. So in Australia, we found 22,000 sites, storage capability of 67 terawatt hours. That's 140 times more than is required to support a 100% renewable electricity system for Australia. The islands of Hawaii, all by themselves, have 7 times more sites than is required for the entire United States. In fact, the big island of Hawaii could service the entire world. The only problem is getting the electricity from Hawaii to the rest of the world. Arizona's got 5 times as many sites all by itself as is required for the entire United States. Zhejiang province, just south of Shanghai in China, has enough sites for the whole of China. And Bali, tiny little island, has 3 times as many sites as is required for the whole of Indonesia. So as I mentioned, we don't bother looking inside national parks. We don't need to. Why have the big arguments with environmentalists? Why not get them on our side? It turns out that when you do the sums, we need about 40 square kilometres of reservoir to support 100% renewable electricity for the whole of Australia. That's about 2 square metres per person, 5 parts per million of the continent. So much smaller, about the same size as your bed or less is the area of land that is your share of the pumped hydro reservoirs required for the whole of Australia. So land use is simply not an issue, and water use is simply not an issue either, in that a PV wind pumped hydro system uses about 1/4 to 1/7 the amount of water that would be used by the existing coal-dominated system because there are no cooling towers on wind or PV systems. the water loss is evaporation off the pumped hydro systems. So we've been modelling 100% renewable electricity, and the number one requirement is that there be no heroic assumptions, no arm waving. So if the technology is not in 100 gigawatt scale production or more, preferably a lot more, then we don't even bother looking at it. And on that basis, the only technologies that are important are PV, wind, pumped hydro, and high voltage DC and AC. Nothing else is relevant. And I submit to you that nothing else will be relevant in the next 10 or 20 years. This is all we need, and it's a very good collection of off-the-shelf technologies in 200 and plus gigawatt production cumulative volume. So we assume that the electricity system in Australia is 90% wind and PV, and the remaining 10% is the existing hydro and existing bio, mainly sugarcane, bagasse, and landfill methane. We spread the PV, wind, the pumped hydro over 1 million square kilometres, right from Townsville down to Hobart and across to Adelaide. And we assume only pumped hydro energy storage because it's the only thing that can be accurately costed. If you try and include batteries, you've got to do a huge amount of arm waving, and we don't need to bother. So batteries and demand management will come for sure, and they'll further reduce this cost. What we're doing is placing an upper bound on the cost of balancing 100% renewable electricity, and it's a low upper bound. So the first thing to look at is what is the cost of building PV and wind farms from scratch now? And if you're talking about 200 to 1,000 megawatt scale PV and wind farms, in other words, reasonably big things, not as big as is happening in other parts of the world, but reasonably big, then you're talking about $50 to $65 a megawatt hour now, and below 50 in 2022, and below $40 a megawatt hour in 2025, I would suggest, based on what's happening in big systems overseas that don't have better wind and don't have better sun. Coal, new build coal, would come in at anywhere between $70 and $120 a megawatt hour, excluding carbon capture and storage, if anyone was so silly as to build it.
Andrew, can I just say for everybody's benefit that equates to, so your $60 a megawatt hour is like 6 cents a kilowatt.
Oh yes, okay, yes. So you're probably paying about $300 a megawatt hour or 30 cents a kilowatt hour for your electricity at a retail level. And all this guff about the Minister for Energy being the Minister for getting prices down is the only way you can get prices down is to attack the retail end. You might conceivably, by doing all sorts of things, get a $10 a megawatt hour off the wholesale price, but when the retail price is $300, that's not going to make much difference to people's bills. So the main problem is overbuilding of the retail system, and the best thing you can do is put solar panels on your house roof if you're worried about your energy prices. Okay, so if we look at the cost of generating secure, reliable, 100% renewables, it falls into two buckets: the generation cost and the balancing cost. Generation is simply getting enough energy over the course of a year, but the energy doesn't necessarily arrive at the right time. You need balancing. And balancing cost comprises storage and high voltage DC transmission to spread the PV and wind from places that have got it to places that don't. And spillage of wind, because you slightly overbuild the PV wind system, it's cheaper to spill a bit than build enough storage to catch it all. And it turns out that the total balancing cost is currently about $25 per megawatt hour, on top of $50 a megawatt hour for a nice wind farm these days. Total cost $75 a megawatt hour, which is below the cost of a new build coal power station. And other people have also done these sums, and that's why industry is concluding that they don't want to build coal power stations, they want to build PV wind because it's cheaper, even adding in the cost of balancing. And this balancing cost is going to go down because it's got various components in there that are going to go down in price, and the energy cost is going to go down. So coal's going up because it's going to get a carbon price at some stage again, and balanced, reliable renewables is going down. But that calculation only pertain to 100% renewables. We're not at 100% renewables. This curve shows the balancing cost in dollars per megawatt hour versus the renewable energy fraction. So at 0 renewables, the balancing cost is 0. At 100%, the balancing cost is $25. But at 60%, the balancing cost is only $5. Most of the cost comes in the last 20%, as you go from 80% renewables to 100% renewables, which is at least 7 or 8 years away. And so in fact, we can build large amounts of PV and wind without worrying about balancing for the time being. And in fact, that dot there at the 66% level is in fact the cost of building Snowy 2.0 and a few transmission lines. Snowy 2.0, if it was constructed, all by itself is enough to support 66% renewable electricity in the Australian electricity system. So we don't have to work very hard for the next 5 or 6 years to push up the amount of wind and PV. We just have to do some basic things like building an Adelaide to Sydney or Brisbane connector, maybe duplicating Basslink and strengthening the interconnectors between Sydney and Melbourne, which the Snowy 2.0 would do very nicely. And then every time you do that, you'd suddenly find that there'd be a dozen companies that would want to build wind and PV farms to max out the capacity of that cable, and private industry would do its usual magic of getting the prices down. But of course, CO2 emissions are not just electricity, they're also energy. And what you see there is a pie chart of Australia's greenhouse gas emissions, and most developed countries look much the same. So electricity is about 1/3 or more of the total, and land transport is another 13%, and low temperature heat, that's water and space heating, is 7%. So 55% is in the bucket which is very easily addressed by existing technology. In other words, renewables takes over electricity, pushes coal out. Gas is pushed out by heat pumps driven by electricity out of the water and space heating market, and oil is pushed out of the market by electric vehicles. All of this is off-the-shelf technology. It's coming very fast and nothing to invent. And of course, the fugitive emissions at 8% we could get rid of simply by getting rid of most of the rest of the coal, oil and gas that we dig up. Then there's only a small wedge of about 20%, which is more difficult. That's high temperature heat and aviation and shipping and industrial processes. This can be electrified effectively, albeit at a slightly higher cost than we currently pay. But it's a small part, a very small part of the overall economy, and we really won't notice the price difference. So electric cars are coming. At the moment it's mostly luxury cars, but by 2020 or the early 2020s there'll be a flood of right-hand drive cars in Australia that fill most of the market niches. And the number of cars is rising globally year by year, not as fast as it should, but hopefully it can be sped up, and this will take care of the 13% of the greenhouse pie that's occupied by land transport, or a large fraction of it. Interestingly, if you build a 1 kilowatt PV panel on your roof to add to the 5 or 10 that you ought to have there already, then that'll produce about 1,500 kilowatt hours per year of electricity. It'll last 25 years, that's say 2 cars, and it'll drive your car 9,000 kilometres a year and cost $2,000. So your PV energy required to drive your car is 1 cent per kilometre. Try and do that with petrol. I'm now coming to the back end of the presentation, and this is new material. We've been analysing the CER material, Clean Energy Regulator data, of the renewable energy pipeline, and it is quite startling what's happening. The Clean Energy Regulator projects a pipeline which is post-financial close of 8.5 gigawatts in Australia of ground-mounted wind and PV, about 50-50. We need 6.4 gigawatts to meet the RET, and so we are already a couple of gigawatts over and above the RET. And effectively all of this will be built, completed, turned on in 2018 and 2019. There is also, the Clean Energy Regulator is projecting 1.6 gigawatts of roof-mounted PV this year. So 3.2 gigawatts roughly over 2018 and 19. So we have a total of about 4 gigawatts of wind, 4 gigawatts of ground-mounted PV, 3 gigawatts of roof-mounted PV, total of 11 gigawatts of new generation capacity in Australia in the 2 years 2018 and 2019. That's 5.5 gigawatts per year, 225 watts per person per year, which is the highest rate in the world by a large margin. So we are the champions. And it's very simple maths to show the implication that this has. So what you see there along the top is the annual demand in terms of terawatt hours, about 260 terawatt hours per year for the whole of Australia. That's the demand for electricity. The green is the rising projection of renewables, assuming that we just keep doing in 2020 and beyond what we are already doing in 2018 and 2019. In other words, 5.5 gigawatts per year of new clean energy. And because PV and wind gets taken into the electricity system before any fuel burning technology, because it is zero fuel cost, it's quite clear that the coal energy generation has to go down, because the sum of the green and the sum of the black has to equal the red. So we are looking at a 50% renewable electricity contribution in 2024 or 2025, 100% in the early 2030s, and meeting our 26% reduction Paris targets in 2025, or 2024 actually. So all of the hot air coming out of Canberra needs to be harnessed as another renewable. But the facts on the ground are simply at total variance with facts in those people's heads. There must be alternative facts or truth not truth or something. And you can do the same for the whole world. PV in particular is growing fast enough to convert the entire world's electricity system to renewables in 2032. And people don't realise the earthquake that's happening because of silicon PV. 2032 is when the entire world becomes renewable electricity, and about 2048 renewable energy, provided that PV continues to grow at the same average rate that it has enjoyed over the last 5 years, 10 years, 20 years, 50 years. So there is real hope for the future, and I come back to the point I made at the beginning, that the only real hope, and it's an excellent real hope, is the silicon solar cell. There's nothing else out there that can displace the 80% of greenhouse gas emissions that belong to fossil fuels, apart from the silicon solar cell. The silicon solar cell has the scale, it has the economics, and it has the low environmental impact to do the job. It's also got the growth rate to do the job, and no constraints. And nothing else can do the job, nothing at all. Everything else is going to be a bit player. The silicon solar cell is the future if we're going to have a livable planet. So that's it, thank you. Yeah, Richard.
Andrew, thank you very much for an inspiring talk. Could you comment on the build time for pumped hydro? I guess I've been a bit disappointed at the slow speed that I've noticed with the ARENA supported one in North Queensland. That seems to be taking forever to actually...
Okay, the build time has got very little to do with the financial close time. The build time for an off-river pumped hydro could be as little as 2 years. Because there are large numbers of excellent sites near most cities. That means you don't have to establish a work camp in a remote region like you would for the Snowy Mountain scheme. For example, Townsville, there's a vast number of excellent sites that would support a high voltage DC cable south, all within daily commuting distances of half an hour from home. So that's one huge saving. The second is the area of reservoir is maybe 100 times smaller and there's no flood control compared with a conventional river-based hydro system. And thirdly, you can build the upper and the lower and the water conveyance and the powerhouse all in parallel. So you can really do it quick, and that's how they will be done when they're needed. The difficulty with the Kidston system is that at the moment there is not enough PV and wind in the Queensland system to destabilise the system. In South Australia there is enough PV and wind. It's now up above 50% and is heading to 100% in 2025. However, it's fairly clear now, I think, that there's going to be an interconnector built between South Australia and Sydney, which will obviate the need for a pump storage in South Australia for the time being. Snow 2.0 has a time constraint in that there's a 27 kilometre long tunnel and awesome environmental issues to be resolved, and a Prime Minister supporter who has just lost his job, so it's not at all clear what will happen there. The important point is that we don't need any new storage of any consequence until about 2024. So we need to really get serious in about 2021, 22. And then we'll have plenty of time to do what's required. The important thing now is to identify all the sites, do a lot of the back work, have them all ready to go, dozens of them, and then they'll just get built when they're needed.
I just wanted to find out, since jobs are so important in Australia, have you estimated at all how many jobs this sort of scheme would provide?
I can't give you an answer off the top of my head, but you're talking about 10 billion a year investment for 20 years or so, and that translates to 100,000 jobs, something like that. One of the big mysteries of Australian politics is the National Party. Virtually all the jobs for the PV and the wind and the pumped hydro and the high voltage interconnectors are in regional areas, and the bitterest opposition to any of this is the National Party members in regional areas. So some of those types get it, like Bob Catter is a very enthusiastic a supporter of renewables. I don't like his other politics, but I like that one. On the other hand, the Energy Minister, Angus Taylor, has a seat just down near here, and apparently he was scarred and seared to his very soul by the Boko Rock wind farm just west of Nimittabel, and hates renewables with a passion, wind in particular. And guess what? His seat has got fantastic wind and reasonably good sun and vast numbers of good pumped hydro sites. I don't understand politics.
Andrew, you talked about high voltage DC cables, but is that in the projections of what Australia would need when?
Yes. You need to strongly interconnect southern Queensland, New South Wales, Victoria and South Australia, and for other reasons you need to duplicate Basslink, because otherwise Tasmania is vulnerable to another failure of the existing Basslink, so you need two connectors. As an optional extra, you should also build a cable to Townsville, because there's a particularly nice PV wind, solar wind resource up there, which is nicely anti-correlated with what goes on in the south for all sorts of reasons. There are also interesting opportunities that we haven't analysed in detail yet of connecting Alice Springs into the Adelaide system or directly across to Sydney. Alice Springs has got fabulous wind, fabulous sun, and fabulous off-river pumped hydro sites all over the place. So it's really, really interesting, and also a time difference of an hour or so.
Just a comment, building a high voltage transmission line takes much longer than building solar and wind farms, probably 3 to 4 times as long. So have you taken that into account?
There's no reason why a high voltage cable has to take very long at all, because you can start at each end and in the middle. The high tech area is at the two ends of the cable. You have to break the megavolt voltage down to the 10,000 volt range using a converter station. It's just traditionally in Australia we can't get our act together for high voltage cables. So most of the time is the approvals. We have an approval system for high voltage cable which is out of the arc is perfectly suitable for a slow-moving fossil fuel system is perfectly unsuitable for a dynamic renewable electricity system. That'll be my take on it.
It's even been quite a big problem in China, where they have very strong control. So about a quarter of their wind farms are actually still being connected.
Yeah.
And it's a problem in northwest and western Victoria, big problem. There are far more solar and wind farms going up there than there is transmission.
Yeah, so transmission constraints are a significant impediment, but it's not an impediment that is intrinsically difficult, because you can start building in 10 different places and then just connect them up. Like if you want to build a toll road, you don't start at one end and build to the other. You start in 6 different places all at once and connect them up, and you fix this bottleneck and then this bottleneck and then this bottleneck, and then after a while suddenly, oh, we've got a whole toll road. And the same with the NBN. You use this bit of existing infrastructure, you have to do another connection here. Little bits, it sort of organically grows. And an organically growing high voltage interconnection system won't produce quite the perfect design you'd get if you did it from scratch. But it won't be very far off, because these are very, very broad optimums. It doesn't really matter exactly where you put all the PV wind. One consequence of constraints on transmission has been that anywhere on the Australian electricity system where there is spare capacity, like every single substation in every single country town, is going to get decorated with the wind and PV farm up to the capacity of that constraint. So you're going to see that's one of the reasons why there's major 100 megawatt scale PV farms going in all sorts of places not very far from the coast, despite the fact that the sunshine might be 10 or 15% better if they go 200 kilometres west. It's just that there's spare interconnection capacity here, so we'll put it in there.
Andrew, what assumptions have you made with regard to module lifetime? And I ask this because a lot of recent reports that are coming out show that the modules are degrading a lot faster, and so you can't assume 80% of capacity after 20 years, but a lot of modules have been installed.
Yes, it doesn't matter very much, for the short answer, for 2 reasons. One is when you've got exponential growth, in 5 years' time, the scale of the industry is 3 times bigger. And so if the loss of a bit of performance from the old modules, you can hardly see it in your balance sheet. The second is there's a thing called a discount rate. In other words, income now is worth more than income in 5 and 10 years' time. And we're using a 5% real discount rate. That's about 6 or 7 nominal. And at that speed, that discount rate, what happens in 10 or 15 years is almost irrelevant for the overall balance sheet of the solar farm or wind farm owner.
Do we have to start recycling?
A silicon solar cell is glass, basically, with an aluminium frame. You obviously get the frame, and ideally you'd probably just burn the glass to burn off the organic pottent material, but really it's about as benign as you can get for... Yeah.
What do you think about the prospects of stacked solar cells? They're much higher efficiency. Are they terribly expensive?
Stacked? Oh, tandem?
Yeah. So getting efficiencies of well over 40%.
There is a huge body of work in universities now looking at 30% efficient tandem cells. The theoretical efficiency for silicon is about 29%. The world record efficiency is about 27%. Production at 25% is now feasible, and I think most solar cells in 5 years' time will be in the 24-25% efficient range. To go up to 30%, you need to add something on top of the silicon. Perovskites, gallium arsenide are 2 candidates. The main problem is that the upper cell takes 2/3 to 3/4 of the power, the solar power, leaving the silicon cell for the balance. And it's easy to show that if the upper cell degrades even a little bit faster than silicon, you're much better off not putting it on the silicon and spoiling the silicon. Another problem is, which people working in perovskites have not taken full recognition of, is the devastating effect of hotspots on perovskites and the consequent unbalancing of the current between in a 2 terminal tandem. So it remains to be seen whether this will happen. Gallium arsenide certainly would be a wonderful addition on top of silicon, and you'd look forward to 31-32% cells. It's just pricey. So we'll have to have a gallium arsenide breakthrough for that to happen. So it's very much an open question, but it's absolutely what should be done in universities to look for the two-terminal tandem in the low 30% range.
You talked about a massive pipeline already existing in Australia for renewables in the next couple of years and beyond. How sensitive is that to federal government policy, given the uncertainty we've had recently, or does their policy just not matter anymore? The economics is so compelling, it's happening anyway.
I think the latter. Certainly, a federal government, if it was sufficiently motivated, could make it difficult. But in the end, it's state policy that determines what happens on the ground. So if you have a string of conservative Liberal governments, then yes, they can severely constrain easily by, for example, amending planning laws so you can't build a solar or wind farm within 500 kilometres of anyone who lives, or just something ridiculous. However, facts on the ground are just running right over the top. The renewable energy target is what basically drove the 8.5 gigawatts that is getting built in these 2 years. But we've already overshot the renewable energy target, and the developers know full well what the renewable energy target is. And I've seen very recent figures which are suggesting that in 2020 the order books for wind are not far short of 4 gigawatts, which is what we're doing in 2019 and 18 per year. And I haven't seen data for solar PV, but it wouldn't surprise me if that was even more optimistic, because you can fit those in short time frames all over the place. Planning permissions are much easier. What's driving it? The Victorian and Queensland targets of 40% and 50% by 2024 and 2030 is certainly driving it, and reverse auctions that are supporting that. And a lot of companies are now realising that the cheapest way to get electricity is to tell AGL to go jump, and making a deal with a wind farm or solar farm company. And also a lot of companies that just want to be seen to be green. It's tuppence halfpenny to do it because the prices are the same whether it comes from a wind farm or out of the ordinary grid. One important point is that the existing 8.5 gigawatt, 11 gigawatt pipeline is going to markedly reduce the amount of coal being used, and that will put a lot of pressure on the existing black coal power stations because they're not operating as much as they would like to be. Their system capacity factors are going to go down and down, and then when there's a major refurb comes up or something breaks down, the owners will say, do we really want to spend $500 million on fixing this thing, or is it better to simply go offline now? So I think we're going to see a wholesale shakeout of black coal power stations rather sooner than later.
Let's thank the speaker again. I think we are running out of time. And thanks for that excellent talk. And